His hands shook when he looked at the screen, and in that one moment, my entire world began to collapse. That's how Joe Carter, a decorated Marine just back from deployment, remembers the day his life turned upside down. Joe wasn't afraid of war zones, bullets, or the endless desert heat. What he wasn't prepared for was betrayal waiting for him at home. 2 weeks after returning from an 8-month deployment in Kandahar, Afghanistan, Joe was finally settling back into civilian life. The excitement of seeing his wife, Melissa, after all that time apart, was overwhelming. He had imagined this reunion every single night overseas. Her smile at the airport, the warmth of her hug, the promise of picking up their lives where they had left off. Melissa had been glowing with happiness when she told him she was pregnant. She even joked, "Perfect timing, Joe. You're back just in time to be part of everything." It felt like fate. After years of military service, countless deployments, and long nights apart, the idea of starting a family seemed like the reward for all the sacrifices. So when Melissa scheduled her first official ultrasound, Joe cleared his calendar. He wanted to be there, to hold her hand, to see the tiny flicker of life they had created together. The clinic smelled of antiseptic and faint lavender air freshener. Joe sat down beside Melissa, their fingers intertwined, as Dr. Evans, the obstetrician, wheeled over the ultrasound machine. The room was quiet, except for the hum of the machine and the soft whoosh of Melissa's breathing. Then came the sound that made Joe's heart swell. The baby's heartbeat, rapid and strong, echoing through the speakers. Joe's eyes misted. This was real. He was going to be a father. But then, something shifted. Dr. Evans froze. His hand lingered too long on the probe. His eyes darted between the screen and Melissa, then back to Joe. His knuckles whitened as he gripped the handle tighter. Joe, trained to notice every detail in high-pressure situations, didn't miss it. "Doctor?" Joe asked, his voice calm but edged with suspicion. "Is everything all right?" Dr. Evans cleared his throat, avoided eye contact, and said softly, "The baby looks fine, but, Mr. Carter, I need to speak with you outside." Melissa's head jerked up. "Why? Just say it here." The silence that followed stretched like a rubber band ready to snap. Finally, Dr. Evans exhaled and said the words that would haunt Joe forever. "Based on the measurements, this fetus is approximately 31 to 32 weeks along." The number hit Joe like a sniper's bullet. 32 weeks? That was nearly 8 months. Joe did the math instantly. At that time, he was thousands of miles away, patrolling dusty streets in Kandahar, writing letters home, and counting the days until he could see Melissa again. His hand slipped away from hers. The room felt suddenly cold. Melissa's smile faded into panic as Joe's piercing eyes locked onto her trembling face. The ultrasound wasn't just revealing a baby. It was exposing a secret. Joe Carter sat frozen in the sterile exam room, his pulse pounding in his ears. The words echoed, 31 to 32 weeks. He replayed it again and again, as if repetition might change the meaning. But the math was merciless. 8 months back, Joe was eating dust in Afghanistan, not lying in bed with Melissa. Melissa shifted uncomfortably on the table, her paper gown rustling like dry leaves. "Joe," she whispered, her voice trembling, "machines aren't perfect. Maybe the doctor miscalculated." Joe's eyes narrowed. His Marine training had honed his instincts, and right now, every fiber of his being screamed that something was terribly wrong. Dr. Evans excused himself quietly, leaving husband and wife alone with the weight of an unspoken truth. Joe leaned forward his tone low and deliberate. "Melissa, I've timed rockets landing closer than this. That doctor isn't off by months. You need to tell me what's going on." Tears welled in her eyes, and she tried to look away, but Joe wasn't letting her hide. He gently placed the ultrasound picture on the counter, the black and white outline of a child who might not be his, staring back at them. Melissa finally broke the silence. "Joe, I was lonely. You were gone for so long. I didn't know if you'd come back this time. I made a mistake. One night, that's all." Her voice cracked, but Joe's expression remained stone. "One night?" he asked, his tone sharp but controlled. "You're telling me one night turned into 32 weeks of lies?" Melissa reached for his hand, but he pulled away. "I love you," she pleaded. "This doesn't change that." But for Joe, it changed everything. His mind reeled back to late-night calls cut short, the sudden pottery classes Melissa claimed to be taking, the neighbor who always seemed to be around when Joe was away. The puzzle pieces slammed into place with brutal clarity. Joe stood up, his military posture rigid, his voice measured. "Who is he?" Melissa shook her head frantically. "It doesn't matter. You're my husband. You came back, and we can raise this child together." "No," Joe interrupted, his voice like steel. "That's not how this works." The room felt suffocating. Joe's chest tightened as if his flak vest were strapped on too tight. He thought of his brothers in arms, the sacrifices, the discipline. Trust was their lifeline, and here, in the home he had fought to protect, that trust had been shattered. As Melissa sobbed softly into her hands, Joe walked to the window and stared at the parking lot below. Parents walked hand in hand. Children tugged eagerly toward the playground across the street. That should have been him, walking with pride, knowing the child he was about to raise was his flesh and blood. Instead, all he felt was betrayal. In that moment, Joe Carter realized that his battle wasn't over. The war had simply followed him home. Joe Carter left the clinic that day with his chest tight and his fists clenched. He didn't shout, didn't slam doors, didn't give Melissa the dramatic outburst she probably expected. Marines didn't panic in the middle of chaos. They observed, calculated, and acted. And right now, Joe needed facts. Melissa had tried to spin the situation, to minimize it. One night, a mistake. We can raise this child together. But Joe knew better. He'd seen it too many times overseas. Lies always had layers. What you saw on the surface was just the tip of a much uglier truth. That night, the silence between them was unbearable. Melissa moved carefully around the house, offering small talk, cooking dinner, pretending life hadn't cracked down the middle just hours before. Joe ate mechanically, eyes fixed on his plate, speaking only when necessary. His mind wasn't on the food. It was on evidence. After Melissa went to bed, Joe stayed in the living room. He pulled out his laptop and began going through old emails, phone records, anything he could access. Deployment had made him miss countless small details at home. Late credit card charges, extra gas receipts, mysterious gaps in Melissa's schedule. Now, in hindsight, every oddity seemed suspicious. There it was, a series of Uber rides billed to Melissa's card during odd hours. Not to her workplace, not to the grocery store, but to a neighborhood just 10 minutes away. Joe zoomed in on the receipts. The address. His gut tightened. It was the same street where his neighbor, Daniel Harper, lived. Daniel, The guy who always waved too enthusiastically when Joe left for deployments. The guy who offered to help out with the lawn and check in on Melissa if she needed anything. Pieces were falling into place. The next morning, Joe called his old friend Marcus, a lawyer who had helped several military families through messy divorces. Marcus listened silently as Joe laid out the timeline, the ultrasound report, the suspicions. "Joe," Marcus said finally, his voice steady, "you need DNA proof. Don't confront her again until you have it. If that child isn't yours and you can prove it, the court will be on your side." Joe nodded, his resolve hardening. Then that's the next step. He wasn't going to let emotions cloud his judgment. He wasn't going to let Melissa twist the story or guilt him into silence. He was going to approach this the same way he had approached every mission. Gather intelligence, verify facts, and then execute. That evening, as Melissa sat on the couch, pretending to watch TV, Joe walked past her without a word. Inside, his heart ached, but his face remained unreadable. The betrayal was personal, but the strategy had to stay prof. This wasn't just about his marriage anymore. This was about truth. And Joe Carter was prepared to uncover every hidden piece of it. Joe Carter moved like a soldier on assignment. Every step was deliberate, every word measured. On the surface, he was calm, maybe even too calm, but inside, a storm brewed. Melissa seemed relieved by his silence in the days following the ultrasound. She probably mistook his restraint for forgiveness. She cooked his favorite meals, lingered near him with forced affection, and kept repeating lines like, "We'll get through this, Joe. You'll see, once the baby comes, everything will be fine." But Joe wasn't interested in false comfort. He wanted the truth. After consulting Marcus again, he arranged a quiet meeting with a private testing lab. He learned that prenatal paternity tests were possible through a simple blood draw from the mother and a cheek swab from the father. The science was solid. The results, incontrovertible. Joe waited until Melissa had another routine prenatal appointment scheduled. On the way there, he turned to her, his tone calm but firm. "Melissa, the doctor wants to run a few additional tests. Just standard stuff," he said smoothly. Melissa frowned. "Tests? What kind of tests?" "Nothing to worry about," Joe replied, keeping his voice neutral. "They just want blood samples for genetic health screening." Melissa hesitated, but eventually nodded. She trusted Joe's composed demeanor, never realizing she was walking straight into a trap. At the clinic, Joe excused himself to the waiting room, while Melissa went in. But instead of sitting idly, he slipped down the hall to the testing office Marcus had connected him with. He swabbed his cheek, handed the sealed kit to the technician, and walked back before Melissa even returned. It felt almost like an operation overseas, except this time, the mission wasn't about neutralizing threats or gathering intelligence in hostile territory. This time, it was about confirming whether the life growing inside Melissa's belly was truly his, or living proof of betrayal. That night, Melissa curled up against him on the couch, her head resting on his shoulder. Joe stared blankly at the muted TV screen. "Joe," she whispered, "you're so distant. Please, talk to me." His jaw tightened. "I'm fine," he said simply. But he wasn't fine. He was waiting. Waiting for the envelope that would decide the rest of his life. The next week felt endless. Every glance Melissa gave him felt staged. Every smile forced. Joe couldn't tell if she was trying to salvage their marriage or simply trying to hide her guilt long enough for him to accept the lie. Finally, the call came. The results were ready. Joe drove to the lab alone, hands gripping the steering wheel until his knuckles turned white. When the technician handed him the sealed envelope, Joe didn't open it there. No, this was something that had to be faced on his own terms. At home, he sat at the dining table in silence. The house was still. Melissa was upstairs, humming softly as she folded baby clothes. Joe stared at the envelope. His heart pounded. He knew, deep down, what it would say. But now, finally, he was about to have proof that his instincts had been right. The envelope sat on the dining table like a ticking time bomb. Joe Carter stared at it, his elbows planted firmly on the wood, his fingers steepled under his chin. The dim kitchen light cast long shadows, and the silence of the house pressed in on him. Upstairs, Melissa's voice carried faintly as she hummed a lullaby while folding baby clothes. An image that might have warmed his heart once. Now it felt like mockery. He reached forward, tore open the flap, and pulled out the sheet. The clinical black print blurred for a moment as his eyes tried to focus. He forced himself to read it line by line, steady and deliberate. Probability of paternity, 0.00%. The words stabbed deeper than any shrapnel ever had. There was no room for argument, no error in the machine, no wishful thinking left. The child Melissa carried was not his. Joe's breath left him in a slow exhale. He sat back in his chair, the paper shaking only slightly in his hand. His chest ached, not from shock anymore, but from the confirmation of what he had already known deep inside. Melissa's footsteps creaked down the stairs. She walked into the kitchen, holding a folded baby onesie. Her eyes softened when she saw him at the table. "Joe," she said quietly, "you've been acting so strange. We should talk." Joe folded the paper neatly and slipped it back into the envelope. His face was unreadable. "You're right," he said, his voice calm. "We should talk." Melissa hesitated, glancing at the envelope. "What's that?" "Nothing you need to worry about." His tone was flat, almost military in its precision. Melissa shifted uneasily, her eyes darting toward the stairs. "I know you're upset about what the doctor said, but I love you, Joe. That hasn't changed." Joe rose slowly from the chair, his tall frame casting a shadow across the kitchen. His voice dropped lower, quieter, but it carried the sharp edge of steel. "Love doesn't lie to my face for 8 months. Love doesn't crawl into another man's bed while I'm bleeding in the desert." Melissa's lips trembled. She opened her mouth, but no sound came. Joe stepped closer, holding the envelope between 2 fingers. "You know what this is? Proof. Hard proof that this child isn't mine. You've been stringing me along, thinking I wouldn't see it. But the truth always comes out." Melissa's eyes filled with tears, her hands clutching the onesie like a lifeline. "Please, Joe, don't do this. We can still make this work. You don't have to leave." Joe's jaw tightened. "I already did my part. I stayed loyal. You broke that. And now?" He dropped the envelope onto the table with a snap. "I'm done letting you write the story." Melissa sank into a chair, sobbing. Joe turned, his boots echoing against the floor as he walked away. His mind was already shifting gears. This wasn't just about heartbreak anymore. This was about action. And Joe Carter was preparing for his next mission. Joe Carter had faced ambushes, IEDs, and firefights in foreign deserts. But nothing felt as disorienting as walking through his own front door and realizing he didn't belong there anymore. The house smelled of Melissa's cooking. Pictures of their wedding still hung on the walls. And yet, to Joe, it was all camouflage. A false front hiding treachery. That night, he barely slept. The DNA results burned in his mind. 0%. Proof so absolute, it felt like a court-martial verdict. By dawn, his decision was made. This wasn't going to be a screaming match or a messy household fight. He was going to handle this like every mission he had ever undertaken, with precision, strategy, and discipline. By mid-morning, he was sitting across from Marcus, his longtime friend and trusted attorney. Marcus had handled family law for years and had guided more than a few service members through betrayal and divorce. He listened carefully as Joe laid out the facts. The ultrasound, Melissa's shaky excuses, the suspicious Uber rides, and now the DNA results. When Joe finished, Marcus leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. "Joe, this is clear-cut. You've got ironclad evidence. The court will not hold you financially responsible for this child. But Melissa, she's going to fight to keep what she can. We need to be smarter, faster, and more disciplined than her." Joe nodded. "Just tell me the steps." "I'll execute." Marcus outlined the plan like a battlefield operation. Secure financial accounts, change passwords, gather documented evidence of Melissa's infidelity, and file for divorce before she could manipulate the narrative. He also advised Joe to keep his composure around Melissa. No angry texts, no threats, nothing that could be twisted against him in court. "Remember, Joe," Marcus said firmly, "in family court, the calm one wins. She's going to cry, plead, maybe even lie outright, but your strength will be in your discipline." Joe's expression hardened. "Discipline is all I know." That evening, Joe returned home with a new kind of calm. Melissa greeted him at the door, her face puffy from tears, her tone soft and desperate. "Please, I made mistakes, but we can raise this baby together. Don't throw us away." Joe placed his duffel bag on the floor and looked her in the eyes. His voice was steady, almost chilling in its calmness. "Melissa, I'm not raising another man's child, and I'm not letting you rewrite what happened. The truth is out. It's not going back in the box." She collapsed onto the couch, sobbing, but Joe didn't flinch. He walked past her, straight to the bedroom, and began gathering the documents Marcus had told him to secure. Bank statements, marriage license, even the framed wedding photo on the nightstand. Each item felt less like a memory and more like evidence in a case file. For Joe, this wasn't about clinging to what was lost. It was about cutting ties cleanly, decisively. The battlefield had changed. The enemy wore no uniform. But the mission remained the same: survive, adapt, and come out stronger. For days, Joe Carter kept his distance from Melissa. He spoke little, moved with purpose, and carried himself like a man preparing for departure. But underneath his controlled exterior, another storm brewed. Daniel Harper, the neighbor, the so-called helpful friend. Joe couldn't shake the memory of Daniel mowing his lawn while he was overseas, lingering a little too long at the fence line, waving with that smug familiarity. Melissa had brushed it off at the time, calling him just a good neighbor. But now, with the DNA results in hand, Joe saw Daniel's face in every gap, every unexplained moment of Melissa's story. One afternoon, as Joe returned from meeting Marcus again, he noticed Daniel's pickup parked 2 houses down. Daniel himself was in the driveway, unloading groceries. Their eyes met across the street, and for the first time, Daniel looked nervous. His wave was awkward, forced. Joe's jaw tightened. He crossed the road with the same deliberate stride he once used to approach enemy compounds overseas. Daniel shifted uncomfortably, setting down a grocery bag. "Hey, Joe," Daniel said with a weak smile. "Glad you're back safe, man." Joe didn't return the smile. He stopped just a foot away, his voice low and calm. "Cut the neighborly act. We both know why I'm here." Daniel swallowed, his Adam's apple bobbing. "I don't know what you mean." "Don't play dumb," Joe interrupted sharply. He pulled the folded DNA results from his jacket pocket and tapped them against his palm. 0%. 32 weeks. Do the math, Daniel. I was in Kandahar. Where were you? Daniel's face drained of color. He glanced toward his front door as if expecting Melissa to appear, then back to Joe. "Look, man, I didn't plan for it to happen. Melissa was lonely. She needed someone. One thing led to another." Joe's hand shot out, grabbing Daniel by the collar and slamming him lightly against the side of the truck. His grip was firm, but his control was absolute. His voice was cold as ice. "You think that excuses betraying me? You think that makes it better?" Daniel stammered. "I'm sorry. I swear I didn't mean for it to go this far. I thought she told you." Joe tightened his grip, eyes burning with restrained fury. "She didn't tell me anything. I found out because a doctor couldn't lie to my face. And now, you're going to stay out of my way. Understand?" Daniel nodded frantically. Yes, I understand." Joe released him, stepping back with military precision. "Good, because the next time I catch you anywhere near my house, it won't be words we're exchanging." Daniel rubbed his collar, avoiding eye contact. Joe turned, walked back across the street, and entered his home. Melissa stood by the window, pale as a ghost, having seen everything. Joe glanced at her only briefly. "Pack your excuses, Melissa," he said quietly. "I'm done listening." For Joe Carter, the confrontation was just one more mission completed. The next battle would take place not on the street, but in court. Melissa had seen everything from the living room window. Joe slamming Daniel against his truck, the cold fury in her husband's eyes, the way Daniel wilted under the pressure. When Joe walked back inside, his boots echoing on the hardwood, she already knew the walls were closing in. For the first time since this unraveling began, Melissa understood she was losing him. Not just his presence, not just his patience, but Joe Carter himself, the man who had always stood steady, the man who had returned home from war to build a family with her. And she was the one who had destroyed it. That night, Melissa tried everything. She cooked his favorite meal, roast chicken with mashed potatoes, the way she had on their first anniversary. She lit candles, set the table, and even wore the dress he once said made her look like the only woman in the room. Joe ate quietly, methodically, never lifting his eyes from the plate. Finally, Melissa broke. She leaned forward, her voice shaking. "Joe, please, I know I messed up. I know what I did was unforgivable, but I need you to hear me. I was scared. I was lonely. You were gone for so long, and I thought I had lost you." Joe set his fork down, his movements slow and deliberate. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't shout. He simply looked at her with eyes that had stared down battlefields. "You didn't lose me, Melissa. You gave me away." Tears streamed down her cheeks. She reached across the table, desperate. "We can still fix this. You're my husband. This baby isn't mine." Joe cut in sharply, his voice like steel. "And don't you dare try to spin this child as some miracle I should embrace. It's living proof of betrayal." Melissa sobbed harder, her mascara streaking. I love you, Joe. It was a mistake, but my heart has always been with you. Can't you see that? Joe shook his head slowly. Love doesn't betray. Love doesn't crawl into another man's bed while I'm bleeding on foreign soil. What you're calling love is convenience, and I won't live in your lie. Her desperation escalated into panic. She slammed her palms on the table, voice rising. If you leave me, you'll ruin everything. People will find out. My family will know. Do you want me to be humiliated? Joe's expression didn't change. You humiliated yourself, Melissa. All I'm doing is shining a light on it. For a long moment, silence filled the room, except for Melissa's quiet sobs. Then Joe stood, pushing his chair back. This marriage is over. I'll handle it through the court. You can beg, scream, threaten, but I won't be manipulated. Melissa buried her face in her hands, shaking with grief. Joe walked past her, grabbed his duffel bag, and headed upstairs. His mind was no longer clouded by anger or pain. His path was clear now. The battle at home was nearly over. The war in court was about to begin. The courthouse smelled of polished wood and cold air conditioning. But to Joe Carter, it felt like another battlefield. The difference was that here, words were weapons, and truth was the only armor that mattered. He adjusted his tie, crisp, clean, military sharpness, and took his seat beside Marcus, his lawyer and ally. Across the aisle, Melissa sat with her attorney. She looked pale, but determined, her hands clasped tightly, her eyes darting nervously toward Joe. Daniel Harper sat a few rows back, shoulders hunched, looking like a man who wished he could vanish into the floor. The judge entered, and the room quieted. Melissa's attorney went first, spinning a tale of loneliness, abandonment, and a woman trying to survive while her husband was overseas. Yes, mistakes were made, the lawyer admitted, but Melissa deserves compassion, not condemnation. This marriage can be saved. Joe didn't flinch. He had expected this. Melissa dabbed at her eyes with a tissue, her performance deliberate, her sobs timed to match her attorney's words. Then it was Marcus's turn. He rose calmly, his voice steady. Your Honor, what we have here is not a story of loneliness, but a story of betrayal. Joe Carter served his country with honor, only to return home and find his marriage desecrated. We have evidence, undeniable scientific proof, that the child Melissa carries is not his. He handed the DNA results to the judge. The room went silent as the papers were reviewed. Melissa shifted uncomfortably, her mask cracking. Marcus continued, his tone sharp but controlled. We also have witness accounts, financial records, and communications that show Melissa engaged in an affair with a neighbor, Daniel Harper, while Joe was deployed. This is not speculation, it is fact. All eyes turned toward Daniel. He squirmed in his seat, finally standing when the judge demanded he answer directly. With a trembling voice, Daniel admitted it. Yes, he and Melissa had been involved. Yes, the baby was likely his. Melissa gasped, tears spilling as her carefully crafted story collapsed in on itself. Her attorney tried to salvage the moment, but the damage was irreversible. Joe sat still, composed, his hands folded. He didn't gloat, didn't smirk. He simply listened. The weight of justice finally tipping in his favor. The judge's ruling was swift and firm. Joe would bear no financial or parental responsibility for the unborn child. The divorce was granted on grounds of infidelity. Melissa would leave with nothing beyond her personal belongings. As the gavel struck, Melissa broke down in sobs, collapsing into her chair. Daniel avoided Joe's gaze, his shame already heavy enough. Joe stood, straightened his jacket, and walked out of the courtroom without a backward glance. For him, this wasn't victory in the sense of triumph. It was closure. The war at home had cost him dearly. Trust, love, years of marriage. But it had not broken him. He was still Joe Carter, soldier, survivor, and man of discipline. And as he stepped into the sunlight outside the courthouse, he knew one thing with certainty. Betrayal might wound, but it could never define him.